The courtroom fell silent as the judge sneered at the twin sisters, mocking their defense. Accused of assault, they stood calm, unshaken. No one expected what came next. When their elite US Army training was revealed, the entire court was left stunned. Had they just misjudged two of the military's finest? The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as the two young women stood before the bench, their identical faces calm but unreadable. Dressed in simple, modest clothing, they stood with their hands folded in front of them, their posture disciplined, their expressions unwavering. The judge, an older man with a reputation for his no-nonsense approach, looked down at them from his high seat, adjusting his glasses as he let out an audible sigh. Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. He flipped through the case file, shaking his head. Twin sisters, both accused of assaulting a man in broad daylight, and yet neither one of you seems the least bit remorseful. His gaze swept over them critically, as if expecting to see guilt written on their faces. The courtroom audience, a mixture of reporters, spectators, and legal personnel, sat in anticipation. Some had already formed their opinions. Two black women, standing before a stern judge accused of violence. Many assumed they were guilty before hearing the facts. A few people whispered among themselves, exchanging glances of judgment. One of the twins, Ava, lifted her chin slightly. "Your Honor, we acted in self-defense." The judge raised a brow, amused by her confidence. "Self-defense?" he repeated mockingly. "Against a businessman nearly twice your size? Do you expect this court to believe that?" Her sister, Maya, remained silent but firm, her sharp eyes locked onto the judge's expression. They had both been taught discipline, how to read a situation, how to anticipate an opponent's next move. This was no different. They could feel the prejudice in the air, the unspoken judgment that their presence alone invited. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a stiff grey suit, stepped forward. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that the defendants attacked Mr. Calloway without provocation. Witnesses saw them strike first." He paused, then added with deliberate condescension, "Perhaps they mistook this courtroom for a back-alley brawl." Snickers rippled through the audience. The judge smirked. "Yes, perhaps they did." His tone carried a weight of assumption, as if he had already decided their fate. "Women like you," he continued, "think you can act like men, throw punches, ignore the law, and then cry victim when things don't go your way." Ava clenched her jaw. She had faced this kind of dismissal before, but hearing it in a courtroom under the guise of justice ignited a slow burn in her chest. She could hear Maya's steady breathing beside her, a silent reminder to keep her composure. They weren't here to lose control. The judge leaned back in his chair. Tell me, he said, his voice laced with mock interest. "What exactly qualifies you to determine when force is necessary? What experience do you have in handling conflict?" Ava and Maya exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them. Neither of them spoke. They knew the moment wasn't right. The truth would come out soon enough, and when it did, the courtroom would never forget it. The sisters had always known struggle. Born and raised in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Atlanta, Ava and Maya learned early that the world wouldn't hand them anything. Their mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep food on the table, always told them that being black and being women meant they had to be twice as good, twice as strong, and twice as prepared as anyone else. Their father had been a soldier, but he died when they were just 10 years old. They remembered the funeral, the folded flag placed in their mother's hands, and the way she refused to cry in front of them. Strength, she had said, gripping their small hands, isn't about what you show people. It's about what you don't let break you. School was never a safe place. Other kids teased them for being quiet, for refusing to start fights, for focusing on their grades instead of falling into the distractions that swallowed so many of their classmates. They saw too many people they knew end up in handcuffs, in gangs, or worse. They refused to let that be their story. Still, being good wasn't enough to keep them safe. One night, walking home from a late shift at a local diner, they found themselves surrounded by 3 older boys from their neighborhood. One of them had a knife. They didn't want money. They wanted control. Ava and Maya remembered what their father had taught them about staying calm under pressure, about watching for an opening. When the first boy lunged, Ava reacted without thinking, grabbing his wrist, twisting his arm back, sending him to the ground before he realized what had happened. Maya took down the second boy with a calculated strike to his knee. The third ran before he could meet the same fate. That night, they understood something important. Survival meant knowing how to defend themselves. By the time they graduated high school, they had one goal in mind, joining the military. Not only to honor their father, but because they needed a way out, a path to something greater. They knew college alone wouldn't be enough. They wanted discipline, strength, and the ability to stand their ground in any situation. Boot camp was brutal. The drill sergeants pushed them harder than most. Maybe because they were women, maybe because they were black, or maybe because they saw potential. It didn't matter. They never backed down. They trained harder, ran faster, lifted more, and fought with precision. When it came time for specialized training, they were selected for an elite combat program. Their skills were unmatched. They learned advanced hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, and tactical strategies that most people would never master in a lifetime. They became warriors. Years later, standing in that courtroom, being judged by a man who had no idea who they were or what they had been through, they knew one thing for certain. They had spent their entire lives preparing for moments like this. The first day of elite training was designed to break people. The instructors were relentless, watching for any sign of weakness, pushing each recruit past their limits. Ava and Maya knew that as black women in a male-dominated program, they had to prove themselves 10 times over. They couldn't afford to fail. The morning started before dawn. A cold wind cut through the training grounds as recruits stood in formation, their breath visible in the air. The lead instructor, a battle-hardened Marine with years of experience, paced in front of them. His gaze lingered on the sisters, skeptical. "You two think you belong here?" he asked, his voice sharp. "This isn't basic training. This is where we create warriors. Most of you won't make it. Some of you will quit, a few of you will break, and the ones who remain, you'll be the deadliest soldiers this country has ever seen." Ava and Maya didn't flinch. They had heard worse, been doubted more times than they could count. They weren't here to argue. They were here to prove themselves. The first test was endurance, a grueling 10-mile run with full gear, followed by an obstacle course designed to wear down even the strongest. Some recruits fell behind, others collapsed. The sisters stayed together, their movements synchronized, pushing each other forward. When their legs burned and their lungs ached, they thought of their mother working double shifts, their father's folded flag, and the promise they made to themselves to never be weak. Hand-to-hand combat training came next. They were paired against male recruits, some of whom outweighed them by over 50 pounds. One by one, they took down their opponents with precision. Their instructors watched closely, noting their skill. By the third week, whispers spread through the camp. The twins were different. They weren't just keeping up, they were excelling. Their tactical awareness, their ability to anticipate attacks, their resilience in the face of exhaustion, it all set them apart. Some recruits resented them, others admired them. The instructors took notice. One night, long after the rest of the camp had gone to sleep, the sisters were pulled aside by a senior officer. He led them to a dimly lit office, studying them carefully before speaking. "You're not just strong, you're smart, disciplined, and you don't break," he said. "We're offering you a chance to take your training further. Special operations." The words hung in the air. They knew what this meant. Covert missions, high-stakes assignments, the kind of work that few soldiers were ever trusted with. Ava glanced at Maya, their bond unspoken but unbreakable. This was what they had trained for, what they had fought for. "We're in," Maya said without hesitation. The officer nodded. "Then get ready, because from this point on the world will never see you the same way again." The courtroom remained tense as the judge tapped his gavel, signaling for silence. The murmurs in the gallery had grown louder, with spectators whispering among themselves. The prosecutor smirked, sensing victory as he paced in front of the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. These two women, despite their well-rehearsed composure, committed an unprovoked act of violence," he declared, turning to face the sisters. "They claim self-defense, but does that justify excessive force? Does that justify breaking a man's ribs, dislocating his shoulder, and leaving him unconscious in the street? The courtroom murmurs grew louder. The judge glanced at the defense attorney, raising an eyebrow. Do you have any actual defense for your clients, or should I proceed with sentencing? The defense attorney, a seasoned woman in her 40s, remained calm. She stood, straightened her blazer, and approached the bench. Your Honor, the prosecution has conveniently left out a crucial fact. The man my clients assaulted was attempting to drag a woman into his car against her will. Witnesses confirm this. A stunned silence swept over the courtroom. The prosecutor's smirk faltered for the first time. The judge adjusted his glasses. Is this true? He asked, looking toward the prosecution. The prosecutor hesitated. The alleged victim has not pressed charges against Mr. Calloway, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Ava and Maya exchanged glances, still silent. Their defense attorney turned toward the jury. So, let me get this straight. A man can attempt to kidnap a woman, and if two black women step in to stop him, they're the ones on trial? A ripple of unease moved through the courtroom. The judge sighed and shook his head. Regardless, he said, the level of force they used. The defense attorney cut him off. Your Honor, my clients are not ordinary women. She walked over to the defense table, picked up a file and handed it to the court clerk. The clerk brought it to the judge, who began flipping through the pages. His eyes widened slightly. Both defendants served in the United States Army, she continued, turning toward the jury. Not just as regular soldiers, but in elite combat training. They specialized in close-quarters combat, counter-terrorism tactics, and hostage rescue operations. The room fell completely silent. Even the prosecutor looked stunned. These women, she gestured to Ava and Maya, were trained to neutralize threats in high-risk situations. When they saw a man attempting to abduct a woman, they reacted instinctively to protect her. And now they stand here being treated like criminals? The judge looked up from the file, studying the twins more closely. Ava and Maya remained stoic, their disciplined posture unwavering. The shift in the room was palpable. For the first time since the trial began, the doubt was no longer on them. It was on the system that had so easily assumed their guilt. The weight of the revelation settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. The judge, who had been so quick to dismiss them earlier, now studied the twins with a newfound hesitation. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, whispers of disbelief, shock, and even admiration. The prosecutor, visibly thrown off balance, attempted to regain control. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. Elite military training or not, these women still used excessive force, he argued. They could have restrained the man instead of hospitalizing him. The defense attorney didn't flinch. Restrained him? And what if he had a weapon? What if he had succeeded in taking that woman? My clients reacted exactly as they were trained, to eliminate a threat before it could escalate. She turned to the jury, her voice unwavering. Had these women been white men in uniform, would we even be having this discussion? The courtroom fell silent again. The unspoken truth hung in the air. Ava finally spoke, her voice even but firm. We didn't attack that man. We stopped him from hurting someone. If we hadn't intervened, he might have gotten away with it. Maya nodded. We've been trained to recognize danger. We've seen what happens when people wait too long to act. We weren't going to let that happen. The judge sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had walked into this trial with a clear assumption. 2 black women standing before him, accused of violence. He had been so quick to dismiss them, to mock them, to play into the expectations that society had long placed on women like them. But now, faced with the reality of who they were and what they had done, he realized he had been wrong. He tapped his gavel lightly. I need a recess to deliberate, he announced. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. The twins were led out of the courtroom, their lawyer by their side. Reporters swarmed the hallway, cameras flashing, journalists shouting questions. The story had shifted. No longer were Ava and Maya seen as aggressors. Now they were heroes. When court resumed, the judge took a deep breath before speaking. After reviewing the evidence and the statements presented, I find that the defendants acted in a manner consistent with their training and in defense of another individual. Therefore, the charges against Ava and Maya Carter are dismissed. A wave of emotion surged through the courtroom. Some cheered. Others sat in stunned silence. The prosecutor, defeated, gathered his papers without another word. The twins remained composed, but the relief in their eyes was unmistakable. They had fought their whole lives, against assumptions, against prejudice, against a system designed to doubt them, and today they had won. As they walked out of the courthouse, their names already making headlines, Maya glanced at Ava. "Guess we made an impression." Ava smirked. "Yeah, and this time they had no choice but to listen."